Continue our journey. And I guess I could entitle my presentation this morning, Christ in the Wilderness. And I had not realized until I began this research that the Gospel of Mark in particular, but to some degree also the Gospel of Luke, places Jesus so frequently in the wilderness. Before I started this work, I thought it was only at the temptation. But that's not true at all. After working on the text for a couple of weeks, I discovered that an old Princeton professor named Ulrich Mauser, a German who taught at Princeton, had already discovered the motif of Christ in the Wilderness in the Gospel of Mark. In fact, that's the title of his book, Christ in the Wilderness. So my discovery has already been made by someone else. I would like, with your help, to go through those passages that I had not noticed before in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus goes into the eremos. The word eremos, of course, means a deserted place. The wilderness. Now, the wilderness can be near to a village, right? It can be a deserted, lonely place in the country between little villages, right? So, Mark chapter 1, immediately after the temptation, Jesus launches into his mission, and Mark describes what he did on the first day of his work. Full of the Spirit, proclaiming the kingdom of God, proclaiming the fullness of time. He goes out to put his vision into action. And on that first day, look at all that he does, because that's the way Mark represents it. He goes into a synagogue at Capernaum. And while he is teaching, you remember what happens? A man stands up in the middle of his lesson who has an unclean spirit, possessed by a demon. Some years ago, I took a group of United Theological Seminary students down to Brazil. And we visited what was, at that time, maybe still today, the largest church in the world. The Universal Kingdom of God Church in Rio. And I did not know before we got there that this church specialized in demon exorcism. So the worship service began, singing and praying, and all of a sudden a man stood up, possessed by a demon. And the deacons, who had been standing all along the wall, they rushed to him and began their ministrations. So something like that happens in the synagogue at Capernaum. And then after Jesus leaves the synagogue, he goes to the house of Peter, Simon Peter, and discovers that Peter's mother-in-law has a high fever. She is sick. And so Jesus heals her. I was at the Mercado, the market in the Bronx this week, and the vegetable seller said to me, "What do you do if you miss your mother-in-law?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And he said, "Shoot again." That is that's Bronx humor, right? But Jesus doesn't respond like that. Jesus Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. And then, listen to this. This comes at the end of the first day. That evening, at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed by demons, and the whole city. So this little city, market town, Capernaum, the whole city gathered around the door of Peter's house, and he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. Wow.
Day of the demon.
Yeah. So we get this picture here of the one who woke up in the middle of his life, Jesus of Nazareth, who learned the lesson of the wilderness, that he had to place himself completely into a relationship with God. You remember last week we discovered that in the wilderness he passed the test by understanding that he couldn't go it alone, right? By understanding that good is more powerful than evil, finally. And so he comes back in the power of the Spirit and begins to do good for people. He begins to set people free from the terrible constraints upon their full humanity that God did not intend. In a world where God rules, Jesus' actions indicate these things will be banished. And that first day of activity must have been exhausting. Now watch what happens the next day. Mark chapter 1, verses 35 to 39. And in the early morning, when it was still quite dark, that's the way I would translate it, having arisen, he went out of the house of Peter and departed into a desert place. The Greek expression, and this comes back again and again in Mark. This was the surprise for me. Eremos topos. Can you say that with me? Eremos topos. A wilderness place. A remote place. It could be not too far from a village. He went out into a deserted place, and there, what was he doing? He was praying. That's right. Now I just want to comment on some of the vocabulary here because it is so vivid and beautiful. When the text says that he went out early in the morning when it was still quite dark, there are two Greek words. The first one is proi. And proi actually designates the last watch of the night. The period between 3 in the morning and 6 in the morning. As I get older, every day I wake up during that time period. I don't know why. But, so Jesus gets up in that period that is still nighttime. And Mark reinforces that with the next word, in nukos, which means in the dark, in the night. So evidently, like me, he couldn't sleep. He was restless. And then, in a way that you probably can't see it in English, Mark emphasizes the fact that Jesus deliberately departed. He went out. Mark uses two forms of that verb. He exited. Exited from the house of Simon Peter. The place where, just the evening before, the whole city had what? Gathered and assembled. And he leaves that place, and Mark emphasizes it. And he goes to a deserted place, an eremos topos, and he goes there, Mark says, in order to pray. And Mark emphasizes the prayer. He puts the verb in the imperfect tense, which means in Greek, that he continued to do it. He began to pray there, and he didn't stop. It wasn't just the kind of prayer that Diane says she has on a roller coaster, Jesus save me now. It was a continuation in prayer. Chapter 1, verse 36. And they were searching for him. Simon, Peter, and those with him. Now, the Greek verb that is translated here, they were searching for him. That translation is not strong enough. The Greek verb is katadioko, which means to pursue. And in almost all ancient Greek text, this word has a negative connotation. It is hostile pursuit. You're going to catch someone. You're hunting them down. Hostile intent is communicated by this verb. Next verse. And they found him, and they said to him, everyone, or all, are seeking you. Now, the fact that Jesus, on his first day, went to stay at the house of Simon Peter in Capernaum, the fact that he drew such a large crowd there, seems to have led the disciples, especially Peter, to a wrong conclusion. Namely, that they did not have to leave everything and follow Jesus. So Peter and his company come looking for Jesus. They chase him down. And they try to do what?
Bring him back.
Bring him back to Simon Peter's house. John Dominic Crossan, that Catholic New Testament scholar who you can see almost every week on the History Channel because of his beautiful Irish brogue. John Dominic Crossan argues that Peter is trying to make himself the broker of the kingdom of God. In other words, he's trying to control access to Jesus. I'm not so sure that that's what the text intends. The text, I think, suggests that the disciples are not yet aware that following Jesus is going to take them completely away from home. That they're going to have to become itinerant as he is. That they're going to have to leave their nets, right? And follow. And watch what happens next. And Jesus says to them, let us go elsewhere to the neighboring towns in order that I might proclaim there also. For it was for this purpose that I came out. The expression here that's translated neighboring towns, it means literally the nearest towns. So the next little market town or village over. And Jesus' response makes clear to Peter and his company that the proclamation of the fullness of time, the proclamation that God reigns in this world, is not to be confined to one place, to Capernaum. He's not going to make his headquarters at Simon's house and wait for people to come to him. He will go to them wherever they are. But notice how Jesus carefully, like a good teacher, good psychologist, how he leads the disciples to perceive gradually the scope of what is involved in joining him and following him. He appeals to them. In the Greek, the verb that he uses here is the verb agomen, which is a hortatory subjunctive. So it's not a command, it's an appeal. would you please go with me? Let's us go. And then he says, would you go with me to the neighboring market towns? In other words, gradually he leads them into a perception of where God's work will take them. It's just the next town over. But once that has started, look at the next verse. And so he proclaimed in their synagogues in the whole of Galilee. And he was casting out demons. So here I think is the first lesson of Jesus' repeated return to the wilderness. The first lesson is that the wilderness is the place where Jesus clarified his purpose. Where he clarified his purpose. That's clear in the Greek. The Greeks, when Jesus responds to the disciples, he says, it was on account of this. It was for this purpose that I came out. That became clear to him. How did that become clear? First, by going out, by removing himself from the residence, and then secondly, by prayer. Well, this insight that the wilderness is a place where we could clarify our purpose. I've been thinking about that this week. And I now have a different attitude toward that 11-hour drive that I make between Dayton and New York. Yeah. I usually fill my time listening to audiobooks about the ancient world. Diane says I'm addicted to sandal flicks. But you know, that could be a place for me to clarify my purpose. My beloved old high school English teacher confided in me after she had become my speech coach and we had traveled all over the country. Mrs. Miller told me, she said, Larry, I come in to the classroom about an hour before any of the students so that I can sit at my desk. Listen to this, old Jewish woman. She said, so that I can sit at my desk and pray. I said, Mrs. Miller, what do you pray for? Well, she said, I pray to God that I will never hurt a child. She needed that prayer because she was an old women's Army Corps. And she was tough. I saw her break up a fight on the parking lot behind the school one day by taking the two boys that were fighting by the ears with her razor-sharp fingernails. They probably had their ears pierced that day. And she took them into the principal's office. So here's what I want you to think about as we follow Christ in the wilderness. And I'll come back to this at the end and ask for your thoughts. At this moment here, at this incredible church, this light in the city, how could this time in the wilderness, in a city with a lot of challenges, how could this be the time and the place where we clarify our purpose? And I'll ask you to think about that individually and as a group. If the text of the New Testament has any wisdom for us, it will involve two things. It will involve exiting, right, from some places where we have been settled down for however long a period, and it will require prayer, extended prayer. All right, the story goes on. This was a discovery for me this week, right, that Jesus is so frequently in the wilderness in the Gospel of Mark. So, Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45. Just after Jesus leaves the wilderness, a leper comes running up to him. And a leper comes to him. appealing to him, entreating him, and falling on his knees to him, and saying to him, quote, "If you will it, you can make me clean." And then the text says, "And Jesus, being deeply moved, stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I do will it. Be clean, be made clean." Now, some of you have probably heard what I'm going to say next, but it's so important that I think it might be worth hearing again. The Greek verb that is translated, "he was deeply moved," in the NRSV, which is very weak at this point, the verb is translated, "he had pity on him," which is just all wrong. The Greek verb is, boy, it's a long one. Don't have enough board to write it on. The Greek verb is splanknizomai. Can you say that with me? Splanknizomai. Now, the splankna are the guts. It's this area down here, the guts, the splankna. And the Greeks had a little, and the Jews too, had a little different understanding of where the emotions were located. We tend to locate the emotions where? In the heart. But in Greek, they are down here in the guts. And we still speak about what? That hit me in the gut. It was a gut-wrenching experience.
It's where you feel it.
It's where you feel it. You're absolutely right. You know, my office and my little apartment is in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the United States. It's in the Bronx. And I go out, not after dark very often, but I go out in the day to shop, and sometimes I have to go to the bank and cash a check. And in front of the bank the other day, there was a young man, I don't know why that always gets me, who, for whatever reason, was completely down on his luck, was lying there outside the bank, sleeping on a cardboard box. And it hit me in the gut. I had a gut-wrenching experience. 12 years ago, when I started teaching at Fordham, for the first time, I had PhD students. I never noticed this before, honestly, until preparing to go with you all on this journey. They went away into a deserted place by themselves. Now, many people saw that they were going, and they recognized them. And the crowd hurried after them on foot from all of the towns and arrived ahead of them. And as he went ashore, he saw the great crowds, and he felt what? Yeah, that's what it says. He felt a wrenching in his guts. The same verb again. Because, he said, they were like what? Sheep without a shepherd. Wow. And so he began to teach them many things. So you're exactly right. The crowd eventually follows Jesus into the wilderness. And there, Jesus and the people discover a relationship. They're like what? Sheep without a shepherd. Jesus is deeply moved by them, by the fact that they are lost. And so he begins to step into the role of what? Shepherd to all these lost sheep. So That's our third lesson of the wilderness, that we can risk following Jesus into the wilderness, into a deserted place. We can do it because He's waiting there for us as the shepherd. We won't be lost in the wilderness. Yes?
Larry, before I attended this class, the thought of wilderness was negative to me.
Yes, to me too.
But I'm sensing it can be a positive place as well.
Exactly. Exactly.
Would you share with us some of your thoughts of how we, in our time, can create a positive wilderness?
Right. Well, when John Paddock first proposed to me that I devote our semester to this subject, he argued that it was a theme of the Episcopal Church, right? And he shared with me that lots of people feel like they're in the wilderness. But like you, I was not attracted to this subject, right? I didn't really see it was going to lead anywhere. Boy, was I wrong. And I think what we can do now is that we can start here. We can begin the process of learning the lessons of the wilderness in our own home, in this church, in this city. But then I think we have to be ready to do what? Go out. To leave some places where we've been comfortable. And to clarify our purpose, right? To clarify what God is calling us to do. Yes?
Clay Shirky.
I don't know that name.
I think he's from Harvard,
Oh,
and he focuses on technology, but he also talks about psychology a little bit. He talks about 3 steps to collective action. The first one is sharing. The second one is collaboration. The third one is collective action.
yes.
And he says they're not equal rungs on a ladder because everybody can share, which is what we're doing now. We're screaming
Right.
at one another,
Right.
on Facebook and
Right.
to get to collaboration means that I have to be okay to be in your presence, to be identified as a follower of Larry Welborn. And you need to feel comfortable being seen in public with Chuck Watts.
Right. Right.
And that has to happen with lots of people before you can get to collective action.
Right.
And they're exponential. Those steps are exponentially large.
Right. That makes
Here comes everybody.
Is the book, just that's all you need to know.
That's the name of the book?
Here comes everybody.
Thank you. Here comes everybody.
Here comes everybody.
That makes a lot of sense to me in terms of the logic of this text,
Yes.
the text of the feeding of the 5,000.
It fits in with David's.
Yes, because the followers, the crowd who go after Jesus into the wilderness, and once again he's overwhelmed by the gut-wrenching feeling because they are sheep without a shepherd. Look how the story ends. They all sit down and they do what? Together they participate in something that has the overtones of the messianic banquet. In the Old Testament prophets, the time of God's favor, the time of the kingdom, was pictured as a time when people would come from east and west and north and south and what? Sit at table in the kingdom of God. So, David, I think that completes maybe the picture of what you were asking for that if we are able to get to the place of collective action, of being together with one another in the wilderness, then something wonderful, miraculous, a little foretaste of the messianic banquet may happen. And this is a great place here at Christ Church for that to begin and to happen because of Waffle Shop, right? I mean, it's the one place in the whole city where people regularly... Diane brings her whole office staff every year. All right, before I let you go, there's one more text I'd like to look at. And I have to admit, here too, I was surprised. It's the text of the Transfiguration of Jesus, when He is transformed. I had not understood that this is also a wilderness text. You remember Jesus leads the disciples where? Up onto a high mountain. Now it turns out that the mountain is associated with the wilderness. In the Old Testament tradition, in the Jewish tradition of which Jesus is a part, there's an intertestamental Jewish text called the Martyrdom of Isaiah. And it mentions that in the midst of his prophetic activity, Isaiah retreated to a mountain in a deserted place, an eremos topos. So Mark chapter 9 says that Jesus took Peter and James and John and led them up on a high mountain. And so now I understand that this is part of the wilderness tradition. A high mountain alone, by themselves. And now Luke, who tells the same story, gives us one more detail. Luke chapter 9, verse 29. And it happened that while he was what? Praying, the appearance of his face was changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Once again, Jesus is portrayed as praying, as opening his heart and his mind to the Holy One, to God. And I think that is part of how we might begin a positive experience of the wilderness, that, we should rededicate ourselves or begin the practice of prayer. I don't pray often enough. I realize that. Prayer is the way in which we open ourselves to the transcendent. And when Jesus is doing that in the wilderness, what happens to him? He is changed. He's changed. The appearance of his face changes. There's a glory that wasn't there before. And finally, of course, the last deserted place to which Jesus goes is Gethsemane. Gethsemane. I had never seen this before. You have to look at the Greek text, Mark chapter 14, verse 32. And they went to an unpopulated place. The Greek word is Chorion. Can you say that with me? Chorion. You look it up in the dictionary, it is a synonym for wilderness. It's just another word for a desolate place, or a deserted place, a wilderness. And they went to a Chorion, a deserted place named Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I" what? Pray. And he took Peter, James, and John with him And then the text says, and he began to be distressed. Another one of those physiological emotions. The Greek verb is ektambeistai. It means to be carried out, blown out of yourself. He began to be distressed, and he began to be anxious. And what happens then? You know the end of the story. What happens to Jesus here in Gethsemane? What happens is that he finally resolves, not my will, but what? Thy will be done. So the last lesson of the wilderness for us today is that the wilderness can be the place where we struggle through distress and anxiety to a point of peace with God, with God's will. Well, I'd never seen all of this before, thanks to you all and the opportunity to follow Christ in the wilderness. Our time is gone. I'm sorry. We've had such a great dialogue here today. Yes?
I have a very brief resource for everybody, and
Good.
we worked with it in a couple of our sessions here. You just go online, William Bridges Transition Theory, and there you'll find tons of information, and it's relevant to everybody personally, and it's certainly relevant to this parish in our time of transition. So William Bridges, B-R-I-D-G-E-S, what a great name for transition theory.
Thank you.
Yeah.
William Bridges Transition Theory. Thank you very
You will
much.
find tons out there.
I wish I could get it on an audio book.
Okay.
Can I?
Oh, yes, yes, you can.
Next week, if you want to read ahead, we're going to turn to the Epistle to the Hebrews, which is dominated by the theme of the wandering people of God. And there's a major lesson to be learned from the people of God in the wilderness. David?
Larry, when the disciples dropped their nets and followed Jesus,
Yes.
do the scholars know if they were single, married, had a spouse, children?
Thank you. Did you hear that question? We only know in one case. Simon Peter has what? A mother-in-law. What happens when you miss your mother-in-law? Shoot again. Aim better. So we only know in the case of Simon Peter that he was married. However, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where Paul is trying to make a case for his own manual labor to support himself, instead of taking what? Contributions or patronage. Instead of entering into a patron-client relationship. Paul tells the Corinthians, he says, I do actually have the right to carry about with me a sister as wife, like the other disciples and apostles of the Lord. So, yes, it looks to me, David, that even though the Gospels only tell us that Simon Peter was married, if Paul was right, a bunch of the others probably were too. Yeah, and I wonder how many of their wives actually joined Jesus. The Gospels repeatedly picture women surrounding Jesus. We know the names of some of them. Mary, Joanna, Mary Magdalene. Michael.
In terms of the virtue of the wilderness, nobody has probably, or no group has probably publicized the good aspects of the wilderness more than the Boy Scouts. We constantly are inviting scouts
Yes.
to come out into the wilderness, to go camping, to learn how to cook,
You're
to
right.
set up tents.
To reflect.
What's that?
Reflect.
But, and that's exactly the point. The founder of the Boy Scouts, Lord Baden-Powell, always proclaimed that scouting was a game with a purpose. The game aspect is the wilderness,
Yes.
is the camping, the hiking, the cooking, using an axe and a knife and fires and guns and all the other attractive stuff that attracts the young boys, and now we hope young ladies as well. But the real purpose is character development. The real purpose is molding citizenship.
Right.
Is even reverence, because we still believe in a God, not necessarily a specific religion, But the whole idea is that Baden-Powell had when he established his first camp, is he took upper-class kids out of the important schools and lower-class kids out of the tenements, put them together for a couple of weeks on an island,
Wow.
taught them the skills, and taught them how to be brothers with each other.
So that's how it started.
Yeah, well,
Wow.
first of all, he taught his men the skills of scouting.
Yeah.
Wrote a manual called Scouting, and in England, the English Army was cheap, they didn't publish the manuals, so the generals self-published them and people bought them, and he became a hero at Mafeking, and the kids in England bought this newly established manual, and during the victory parade during the Boer War, these kids were self-organizing into scout units, waving his book, like the kids in China with Mao's little red book. And he rewrote the book Scouting for Boys and conducted the experiment at Brown Sea Island, and that got scouting started.
Wow.
The thing is we attract the boys out of their normal environment. Show them a good time, let them have fun, which attracts them, and then we try to change their character and help them grow.
I didn't know any of that. I didn't know any of that. Thank you all so much for today. I have to go teach at another church. I'm sorry. Thank you all so much.
Okay, good. Oh, by the way. Yeah. I want to tell you. He was the mayor. His house. Yeah, his house.
Cut off at the pass. That's a good point. That helps me understand why his house was the mayor.
Yeah, he had to be the mayor.
All right. Week after next.
Week after next.
Our plan is to leave before we have dinner. Okay. Unless you really want to drive, I don't want to. Jane, she was sitting there, you know,
There is some down there.
well, what you're to say, you want to. So, you can stay and stay for dinner. You know, right. I mean, and leave that. Tell your guy I said hi. I will. I Okay. Okay, all right, that'll work. I know, I think I it was not very hard. Okay, so you can. But it's basically going to Cincinnati, which is you get off on that exit, you turn right, you go to the light, you see the school, ground, it's that light, you turn left. It's 4 or 5 ways. Where specifically? On the ground? Wow. And the nun will probably appear and say, oh, that's over there. She will say, oh, yeah. We will ask, just wanted to
The house there, that's
And I had a dedicated research assistant. Slave labor. PhD students have to work for professors to justify that big scholarship money that they get. So one day I called my research assistant into my office and I said, I'd like you to go over to the library where they have a great big database called Thesaurus Lingua Graeci. For a whole generation, graduate students in California, at the University of California, Berkeley, they stood at scanning machines. And they scanned every Greek text known. Literary text, inscriptions, coins, broken pieces of pottery called ostraca. They scanned them all into a database. Can you believe that? And then a clever graduate student at Duke University wrote a search program called Perseus, the horse with the wings. And so you can now go to the library and you can enter a Greek word into that database and it'll show you every place that the word is used in ancient Greek. So I gave that as an assignment to my graduate research assistant. She came back the next day, and I'll never forget. What she reported to me was so surprising and dramatic. I was sitting at my desk with my teacup, my favorite teacup that Diane got for me at the Renaissance Fair. And I was so excited by what she found that I dropped my teacup on the floor and broke it. Yeah, it's all gone. Here's what she came back and reported. You ready for this? In all of ancient Greek, this word, he felt a tugging in his guts, gut-wrenching, is most frequently associated with Jesus of Nazareth. Either in descriptions of him, like this one, or in parables that he told. Like the Good Samaritan parable, right? The Good Samaritan feels what? A wrenching in his guts. Listen. This is a Jesus word.
Say it again.
Splanknizomai. Splanknizomai. He felt a wrenching in... This is, Chuck, this is as close as we are going to get to the mind of Jesus, to his emotional, psychological, lived experience. We can't get any closer than this. The word is more frequently associated with Jesus than any other person from antiquity.
Okay, I'm taking a picture of it.
Please. I'll remove the blighted part from them.
Fine.
And so the text continues. Oh, I should tell you about this leper. A few years ago in Egypt, they discovered a new gospel. It's only a fragment. It's called Papyrus Egerton number 2. Egerton was the name of the rich British man that bought the papyrus. And in Papyrus Egerton number 2, the same story, the story of the healing of the leper, is found near the beginning of the surviving fragment. But there is an interesting difference. The leper says to Jesus, I was journeying with lepers and eating with them at the inn, and so I too became a leper. Isn't that interesting? Well, Mark's story continues. And immediately the leprosy departed from him, and he was cleansed. And then it says, listen to this, and this is my translation. Here I'm really departing from the New Revised Standard Version, but I would translate the rest of the verse like this. And being deeply moved by him, deeply moved by the leper, immediately Jesus sent him away and said to him, go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a proof for them. Now, why does my translation differ? Well, first I need to show you how much it differs. Listen, the Revised Standard Version translates that same verse and sternly warning him. Why? He sent him away at once. Now, why do I question the wisdom of a committee? That's who translated the New Revised Standard Version. You can actually see their pictures. The Revised Standard Version was translated at Yale, and there is a room at Yale Divinity School called the Revised Standard Version Room. Have you been there? No. And there are beautiful oil portraits of the 19 men, all male, all white, who translated the Revised Standard Version. Now, why do I question the wisdom of that committee? Yes?
Groupthink, they all have their political needs, and they wanted to read the way they wanted to read.
Yeah.
None of them had the right key.
And sternly warning is just so untypical of what Jesus was going to be doing. If he's feeling a wrenching in his gut, over and which gets translated as pity, why would you ever sternly warn? All he's doing is saying, I'm rejoicing with you, but let's let it be known publicly. So go to the priests so that it is seen, offer the sacrifice so that it is proclaimed.
You're right, Michael. The committee has introduced a tension into the text. Now, the verb here, the verb is the verb embryomai. Can you say that with me? Embryomai. And it's another emotional verb, like splanknizomai, and it can mean two things. Sternly warn, right? Warn sternly, that's what the committee chose. But it can also mean be deeply moved, feel strongly. And Michael, for the reason you gave, because the preceding verse spoke about Jesus feeling a wrenching in his guts, for that reason I choose the second translation. He literally, it means he boiled up inside, embryomai. His emotions boiled over. And he told the man, go show yourself to the priest. Now, the point I'm trying to make here in this story is that as Jesus goes about his mission, liberating people, proclaiming that God rules, Mark portrays him as overwhelmed by what?
Empathy.
Yes, strong emotions of empathy. That comes right clearly through the text. He feels a wrenching in his guts. He begins to what? Boil over with emotion. And then watch what happens next. He, that is the leper, went out, and he proclaimed it freely, and so the word spread, so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly. Now watch how he responds. So he went into the wilderness places, and people came to him from everywhere. He went into the Eremos Topois, the wilderness places. Luke tells this story in Luke chapter 5, verses 15 to 16, but Luke's story ends a little bit differently. Luke says, "But now more than ever, the word about Jesus spread abroad. Many crowds would gather to hear him and to be cured of their diseases." Listen, "but he would withdraw to the deserted places, the Eremos Topois, and he would pray." Luke adds that. I love the translation of this part of Luke in the Greek dictionary by Walter Bauer. Walter Bauer translates it, "He would steal away to the lonely places and pray." So, coming back to your point about empathy, Chuck, what is the lesson here of the wilderness? The lesson is that the wilderness can be a place where we learn how to deal with what? The powerful emotions that overwhelm us if we respond to God's call to be agents of the kingdom in the world. The powerful emotions that are aroused by God's calling and mission. And I have to confess that I need this lesson, right? I turn on the radio and I hear all the evil in the world, the corruption and the malice, and I get overwhelmed with indignation. And in the morning, usually after my second cup of espresso, you know, I'm so overwhelmed with emotions that I could do something that I would regret, or say something that I would regret. So the lesson for me is that the wilderness might be a place where I learn how to deal with the emotions that are aroused by responding to God's calling. Yes, Nancy?
The word
Embryomai.
yeah. Is that related in any way to the embryo of a babe that is...
Good question. The answer is I don't know. You're the first one that ever asked me that. I'll go find out.
It would make sense. It's an embryo it's developing and it's going to get bigger and bigger, which it, you know, is what
Yes,
needs bigger.
I'll find out. What is true of both these words, splanchnizomai and embryomai, is that these belong to the physiology of the emotions, right? The way in which the body and the psyche are connected to one another. Chuck?
So there are two men that in the last decade or so have engaged me so much in this kind of thing, and where friendships are really strong, and that's you and George Lakoff.
Oh, yes.
And there's a section in his book on Don't Think of an Elephant. Toward the end of the book, he's outlined, progressive thought that's empathic and nurturing, and conservative thought that is strict and sometimes bordering on the cruel. And there's a section that's called How to Respond to Conservatives. And he tells a story that he said, in my classes, I would go through some of this, and Thanksgiving would roll around, or the holidays, and his students would say, I'm just dreading going home for Thanksgiving or Christmas, because I'm going to be fighting with my conservative uncle, and we're just going to be going back and forth and back and forth. It's just awful. And he says, don't fight with your uncle. Don't fight with your grandma. They want to love you. Ask them this question. The question is, I think, what Jesus is doing here. And the question is, what are you most proud of that helped the most people outside your family? And then just listen to them, because that activates the neural pathways of empathy. They have to think empathically, right? And ask questions about that. So it strengthens, it engages. And one of the challenges, he says, is once you're talking about empathic things, and that's called in-group empathy. How do you help your uncle or your grandfather extend that empathy to the rest of us?
That is a lesson. I'm going to have to go read that last chapter of the book.
It's toward the last chapter.
I'm going to have to go read that, because I have a confession to make to you all. I mean, the immediate reason, the practical reason that I'm here today, rather than with my wife down in Arkansas, is because I had committed to teach this class. But how many years ago was it? 1977. When I left Arkansas and moved up to New Haven, the church community that I was part of down there, which was very conservative, more conservative probably than anyone that you all here have known, they didn't allow women to participate in ministry, for example. Fundamentalist reading of the Bible. And when I was in college, together with 4 friends, I started publishing a little newspaper, a little paper of religious opinion called The Disciple. And in the second issue of that journal, the lead article, which I wrote, posited psychological development in the case of Jesus, that he grew, as Luke says, in wisdom and stature, in favor with God and human beings. The president of the school and the chairman of the religion department were so scandalized that they seized my paper and shredded it on the college campus.
Well done.
And they undertook, they started against me a procedure in that church which was called disfellowshipping.
Oh, man.
So, the reason that I only go back to Arkansas once a year is that I was pretty much run out. I was exiled. And so, this lesson, right? The lesson of the wilderness, that the wilderness is a place to learn how, first of all, to deal with our own overwhelming emotions, gut-wrenching, boiling up in indignation. And I need to learn that in order to be able to follow Lakoff's suggestion and engage constructively, right? Not destructively. Yes, Michael.
if you go through the rest of Mark with us and document all of these transitions between public ministry, teaching, and healing,
Yes.
and going off to the wilderness, you will be here until Christmas.
Well, that's all right with me.
Because it is such an overwhelming pattern
It is.
in Mark, it goes through in cycles 40 or 50 times. You'll see 3 and 4 instances in a single chapter. And there's also the practical reason, of course, that if Jesus is feeling so much emotion when he is dealing with these people he is ministering to, then he needs that release on that time away. And practically, that's the only time that he can get to pray when he's not dealing with people, and that's when he leaves. But there's a second thing, and it may go towards your idea of psychological development. There's the whole emphasis in Mark of the messianic secret.
Yes.
You're not supposed to tell people who Jesus is, that you're not supposed to reveal that he is the Messiah. But there is many times the most detailed healing stories he comes up with is a person who makes a leap in logic beyond what Jesus has done in the past. Starting with, the demoniac in the synagogue, who breaks the rules by saying, I'm going to ask to be cured during the service. The leper, because a leper is so unclean, he's not supposed to be in contact with people. He comes up and Jesus breaks that, and part of his response is to touch the leper.
Yes.
But then all the rest of the times you will find these detailed healing stories where somebody goes beyond. The woman during, when he is on the way to cure Jairus' daughter, and then intact has to raise her from the dead instead, the woman who says, I just need to touch his cloak.
She touches him, yeah.
And then you find 2 chapters later that people are lining up to touch his cloak as he walks through the town. So what he has is a whole detailed picture of people expressing greater and greater faith without necessarily knowing he's the Messiah, because he's not supposed to be told that, but just concluding that he is, and they make that assumption, they make that approach in faith, and every time it is sort of an accelerating, deepening, more profound faith, story by story, that he has to respond to.
Yes. There is a deep psychological wisdom in Mark's gospel in that way. Yes.
So Larry, could that, and follow on what Michael said, are these not these people's wilderness journeys? And they find Jesus
Right.
at that moment.
Right.
And that is a clarifying point for them.
Right. You're absolutely right.
They themselves, regardless of the fact that it's in a crowd of people or in the middle of nowhere, right?
I'm so glad you've noticed that. As we will see, the crowds, the followers of Jesus in Mark's gospel, they begin to go with him into the wilderness. Watch that. That's about to happen. But before we go there, let's just take account of the 2 lessons. The 2 lessons we've learned so far. First of all, the wilderness is a place where we might what? Clarify our purpose. Second, where we might begin to deal with those powerful, empathetic emotions in a constructive way. And now, following the insight that you just shared, watch what happens next. Mark chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000. I'd never noticed this before. Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. They've come back from the mission. Jesus sent them out 2 by 2 to propagate, to continue his work of good news and healing and exorcism. And so they come back. Chapter 6, verse 31. He said to them, this is so interesting, the way that, you can't see it in English, but the Greek shoves it in your face. Jesus says, humes autoi, you yourselves, come away into a what? Eremos topos. Into a deserted place, a wilderness place, and refresh, rest, pause a little. For many were coming and going, and they had no time even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a eremos topos, a deserted place by themselves. See,